Welcome to Gospel Tangents. I'm your host, Rick Bennett. Please consider donating or purchasing a transcript by going to our website, gospeltangents.com/shop. You'll help support other documentaries and podcasts such as this. Mark Hofmann's most famous forgery was known as the White Salamander Letter. It threatened to rewrite Mormon history and fooled many Mormon experts. Mark didn't just fool Mormon experts. He actually tried to sell something to the Library of Congress, and many of those experts were fooled as well. Let's listen to our conversation. People who may not be familiar with the Salamander Letter, why is it called that, what was in it, and that sort of thing.
Well, the thing that was such a big deal about the Salamander Letter, or White Salamander Letter, was that it was in the hand of Martin Harris, and that just, there wasn't anything previously known, and it gave a much different story about the plates and what happened at the Hill Cumorah. It was such a dramatic departure from the traditional stories because Joseph is there to get the plates in the hill, and there's a white salamander in the hole, and it's transformed into a spirit, and it's just it had all these magical folk magic kinds of connections and so on that nobody had ever heard before. It was just such a, it was as different a story or a different take on the traditional story as one could imagine. And so he had claimed to have gotten it back east as a letter that came into his hands through a compatriot of his, when actually later we find out that Mark created the document. But it kind of turned Mormon history on its head, and then you have people squaring up on each side, scholars that are trying to make sense of it, and others just saying that there's no way that could be true, and Steve was paying researchers, this is over a period of time obviously, to look into it, and we had some genuine scholars looking at why this all made sense and putting it into the historical context of folk magic and the Smith family's belief in folk magic and those kinds of things that nobody had, well, I shouldn't say nobody, people had looked into the Tanners. Early anti-Mormon works had a lot of these kinds of things that Mark built on. He knew his stuff, he knew his history, and so he didn't just create documents out of whole cloth, so to speak. Usually used paper. But he had background, and it made sense if you knew your history. So there was a big debate about whether this was real. Of course, it was tested, and Steve was the one that bought it and to give to the church. As I recall, it was $40,000, which was a lot of money back then in the 80s. Still is. But that was the one that really got the most attention, and just, that had...
So had that been authenticated at the time of the bombing? There was no... at the time of the bombing, I don't think there was any doubt about its authenticity. Everybody believed it was authentic.
Well, not everybody, but those who worked with it and tested it and so on did. But there were people, especially that are looking at it from afar, that it just never made any sense to them at all.
And I think the Tanners,
right.
They're known as anti-Mormon, Gerald and Sandra Tanner, were one of the skeptics, which, that seems kind of strange, doesn't it?
They were skeptical, they certainly didn't think that it was a modern forgery, or that Mark Hofmann had anything to do with it until later. But yeah, they were skeptical. They were among the earliest skeptics.
What were their reasons for skepticism?
Yeah, they were looking at it in historical context, and I think just content wise. But you know, I can't remember exactly what if you were to take the top three arguments against, but I think they felt that it was probably an early forgery.
Oh, okay. That's interesting.
And I don't think they ever laid it at his doorstep.
At Hofmann's doorstep.
Until later.
Okay, so they thought it might have been an early forgery.
I think so, if I remember right.
Okay, that's interesting. You know, that's cool. Yeah. What are some other documents that Hofmann forged that you're familiar with?
Well, one is, as I was telling you a little bit about earlier, the letter from Carthage jail. It was a letter from Joseph Smith to Jonathan Dunham, who was the head of the Nauvoo Legion, calling upon him to come and rescue them, basically. And so that would have probably been the last thing that Joseph ever wrote.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so that was big.
I think, and that has actually been used, I believe Quinn used that in one of his books, Extensions in Power, or Origins of Power, I can't remember.
He may have.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you mean as a
source?
As if
yeah.
it were.
I remember reading that in one of Quinn's books and being like, "Oh, I didn't know that was a Hofmann forgery."
Well, you know, in Dean Jesse's personal writings of Joseph Smith, there were either 6 or 8 items that were in there that were forgeries that they had to do an errata for, and then take it out in later edition. But there were several books that had references to Hofmann forgeries that had to change those later.
Wow.
But the Dunham letter, and it's part of a complicated story. I don't know that you want to get into the whole thing here, but he had promised it to Brent Ashworth a long time before for a lot less money. Brent was the one that said, wouldn't it be great to have such a letter? And yet Mark sold it to another collector. But in order to get back in Brent's good graces, Mark had us, and I say us meaning Deseret Book, buy it back from this collector so that he could make it available to Brent for a lot less money. So he actually took a big loss on it.
Oh, wow.
To offer it once again to Brent. We don't have the time to really flesh that all out, but it was bizarre, as I found out later. But the numbers were incredible. So the price was $100,000
for the Dunham letter.
Yeah.
Wow.
And that's in the 80s. So that was I'm sure that was the most money ever put on any Mormon document at the time.
Wow. I was reading the victim's book. I know another big document was the patriarchal blessing of Joseph Smith III. Can you tell us what you know about that?
Yeah, because that also impacted me in an indirect way. There had always been stories and some documentation of Joseph Smith having a variety of methods of succession for him. I don't think he ever really thought he was going to go when he was young, be taken. So he explored lots of ideas for his succession. But one of them was his son, Joseph III. And so Mark created this document, which was done in Thomas Bullock's hand. And boy, you see it, and it looks just like Thomas Bullock's hand.
Wow.
He was amazing. I mean, his versatility was amazing. Men, women, different ages. It's just unbelievable how many different signatures and how many different hands he could do. But it basically confirmed the reorganized church's story of how Joseph III had been blessed and was supposed to be the successor to his father. And And so they wanted to get that, and Mark started to negotiate with them, but ended up selling it or trading. I think could have been cash and trade, I don't remember, to our church, to the LDS church. And so that made them upset. And anyway, there was negotiating back and forth because, it made more sense to have that in the hands of the reorganized church. And so there was a trade for a Book of Commandments, which is the 1833 compilation of Joseph Smith's revelations that was never finished because, as you remember, the press and the pages and so on were destroyed by a mob in Independence in July of 1833. So a very rare book. Well, at the time, the Book of Mormon, first edition, 1830, was probably selling for about $5,000. And somebody speculated that a Book of Commandments would be worth $20,000. And so the church got a Book of Commandments in exchange for the blessing. And so one day somebody called me up at Deseret Book and said, that book they've been talking about, the Book of Commandments? Well, I have one. Yeah, I'll bet you do. I mean, I'd heard that story before. And anyway, to make a long story short, brought in the book. It was a real Book of Commandments.
This is from Mark Hofmann or something?
Well, no, this kind of brought it out from this. I mean, this guy knew from hearing on the news about this Book of Commandments that the church had gotten and the value of $20,000. He knew he had this old book in his house in this desk drawer, and sure enough, it was that book. So that's when he called me and brought it down, and it was a genuine Book of Commandments. And so we've negotiated, and I agreed to buy the book for $16,000, which is 3 times the price of a Book of Mormon. Wow. But sold it immediately, made a good profit, and my superiors were happy. But that came about because of, in a manner of speaking, because of the Joseph Smith III blessing.
Wow. So this was just somebody in Salt Lake that had a Book of Commandments lying around. Wow. He and his family had inherited. So how do you authenticate something like that? How did you know it was real?
Well, I'd seen a lot of old books, and certainly had several of the first edition of the Book of Mormon, and I can't remember if I don't think I'd actually seen one before, unless I'd seen it over at the church library, but it met all the tests. You could just tell from the binding, from the age of the paper and the look and so on. And then, and then the guy that I sold it to had seen several and held them and had actually been involved in the sale before, and so there's no doubt about it whatsoever. And I've seen several since. Wow! But so if I bring that was exciting. Yeah, what?
If I bring an old book, you can authenticate it?
Probably. I mean, that is a question about authentication that I get asked a lot when it comes to documents, especially because documents are unique. Books are not. I mean, they're printed and bound at the same time usually, and it can meet the sight and the smell tests and so on. But documents, that's a lot harder thing, and people wonder about how Mark was able to create these documents and have nobody catch him at it. Well, he knew what he was doing. He used the right ink from old recipes and the right paper that he stole from libraries, period paper. He did his homework, so to speak.
Well, and that's one of the things in that victim's book. One of the things that I noticed was Mark would trade legitimate forged documents for legitimate documents, which
right.
kind of, I'm sure, muddied all those waters as well.
Right.
And in one case, I remember, and I have to wonder, what did the church officials think when he made the request that he would like some blank pages from the first edition Book of Mormon? And I guess the reason why was because then it would be from the period paper, so it would be actual period paper. So if you did I don't know if it's a carbon date test or whatever, it would match the time period,
Right.
and then he would
Right.
write on it.
Right. He stole paper out of old books from several local libraries to do that very thing. And then he used the formula for the ink. He actually got it from a book about forgery.
Oh, really?
Yeah, by a famous book dealer. And
So he would make his own inks.
he made his own ink, and the problem was he had to make it look old. Obviously it was freshly applied, and so he used a variety of substances, and eventually that tripped him up because in this artificial aging process, it created a cracking effect in the ink that under ultraviolet light was visible and under microscope. And so they were able to determine, later on which ones were forgeries and which ones weren't in the church holdings and elsewhere. But he was able to fool a number of experts that did tests on some of his documents, and they were not able to detect that they were forgeries, or it was unclear. Like his Oath of a Freeman, which was the first printed item in America that he tried to sell to the Library of Congress for $1 million to $1.5 million.
Wow.
He completely created that. He had the plates made for it. He printed it and altered letters and kind of rubbed them down so they looked old, and he did all kinds of things. And the Library of Congress was doing tests on it, and the American Antiquarian Society was another that looked very closely at buying that. And that was a huge deal when that failed to sell, because Mark owed so many people money because of his schemes, and a lot of it was over the McClellan collection, which nobody ever saw, but there was a lot of talk about and a lot of money that changed hands over it. And because that failed to sell, the Oath of a Freeman, Mark was in a world of hurt financially and had to come up with money.
Because the Library of Congress document.
Yeah, they did not buy it, and neither did the American Antiquarian Society.
Is that because they thought it was a forgery? Or
No, they never determined that it was forgery.
So they thought
part of it
was
was price, I think, and they weren't positive that it was good. I mean, nobody had ever seen one before.
Oh.
It had never. They knew what the text was, but nobody knew what it looked like. So Mark was able to create it, and he also he planted it at Argosy Bookstore in New York, and had several things put on a receipt that he bought that day, and that was one, so that he could establish that he had bought it from a reputable bookstore in New York City.
Wow. And
I remember him telling me about that, showed me the invoice, and there it was, Oath of a Freeman, $25 as I recall.
He brought it into the bookstore and then bought it.
Exactly.
Okay. Wow.
Along with some other things, kind of threw it in the mix and said he had found it up with the pamphlets. They had an entire room that was just, early pamphlets and books and things like that, and they didn't inventory everything, so as far as they knew, it was one of their items.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's quite a schemer he was.
Oh, he was.
I hope you enjoyed our discussion with Curt Bench. In our next episode, we're going to talk about the first day of bombings. Curt will tell us how he learned about them and all the experiences he had that day, even his attempts to warn Mark Hofmann that there was a bomber out there.
I was actually driving to work that morning, and they said there was a bomb that had gone off in the Judge building. It was just a few blocks from where I worked, and they even, as I recall, gave the office number and said a young businessman had been killed. Well, I only knew one person in the Judge building, and that was Steve Christensen. So as soon as I got to my office at work, I looked up in my directory under his name, and there was that office number in the Judge building, and I was yeah, I was just sick. Physically, I mean, it was just, it was horrible.
Click here to subscribe, click here for a transcript, and over here you'll see some other videos that we've done here on YouTube. We hope you'll use this as a valuable resource to learn more about Mormon history.